wife. So I'm looking at very nervous, I'll be honest with you here. First of all, again, thank you guys for being here, especially this group from Natalia that spent the weekend with us. What a blessing it is to be able to spend time with you guys and to share and enjoy this marriage seminar. John Moore, for those who may not be aware, is he and I are friends for a while now. I think the first time maybe I met John was back in the 90s. He was the director of the Bible Church at San Marcos. But John has been a friend, a teacher, a mentor, and we have had many years that we've been working together on different projects and things like that. As for a lot of individuals that I talk about here, I say this about them, I mean it, there's not anyone in the Lord's church that I have a higher regard for than John Moore. He is up there with people that I really respect, not just because of all the things that he's done for the church, but because of the heart of the service that he has as he does them. You're not going to find more genuine Christian individuals. John has already this week presented some fantastic lessons, given us many things to think about. I know certainly as a husband he has challenged me and reminded me of what is most important, and I appreciate that. And he's going to continue to do that this morning for us. And so I'm not going to take up any more of this time, John. Come teach, brother.
Good morning. It is good to see you, and we have just been so encouraged by the weekend. You all have helped us and strengthened our own marriage and given us an opportunity, as we do with each of these seminars, the privilege of being able to think about our own relationships and how to be as the Lord wants us to be. So hopefully we've encouraged you. And if you're not married and you're here today, don't worry. We're going to be covering some general principles and things that will be helpful in every setting, in every situation. So it's wonderful to be here, wonderful to be with the Hammocks. We love them so much, and thank God for them. And I could go on and on about he and Melissa and their kids, and just grateful, and I'm grateful that they're here with you. So this weekend has been dedicated to learning about traveling down the road of marriage. And as we travel down that road, there are at times obstacles, roadblocks, there are hazards, but there are a lot of joys, and there are a lot of blessings. And we've tried to cover some of those this weekend and talk about learning to communicate effectively and to learn the rules of the road. One of the things, though, that we did not really talk a lot about, and that is the struggle that we all have to forgive, and that what happens when we find ourselves in a crisis situation. No doubt some of you sitting right here this morning have endured some crises of your own. If you haven't, you probably will at some point in the future. Life has a way of throwing at us some real difficult things. But even if it's not within our own physical family, certainly God's spiritual family has faced some crises. And we have faced various challenges to unity, and we have found it at times maybe difficult to forgive. So part of what we're going to talk about this morning has a broad range of application in many ways. But if you're a human being, you, like all human beings, I think are going to find it difficult at times to forgive. We struggle to forgive, especially those who have really harmed us and hurt us in some way. Now, as we think about forgiving, certainly the greatest example of all, of one who has demonstrated the power of forgiveness and who has, even from the cross to those who put him there, cried out to the Father, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do," serves as the ultimate example of love for human beings, serves as the ultimate example of what we can do and how we can approach this enormous and important topic. The cross of Christ and the crown of thorns reminds us of the ultimate act of forgiveness. What Jesus endured, not because he was guilty, but because of a greater purpose in mind in seeing the salvation of souls. But sometimes we say, well, that's the Lord. God forgives. He has a tremendous capacity for being able to forgive more than maybe any individual or human being might. So is there another example we could appeal to? And indeed there is. There's one found in Genesis chapters 37 through 50. If you have your Bibles, and I hope that you do, open up your Bible to Genesis chapter 37. We're going to cover a lot of ground this morning. And in many ways, Genesis 37 through 50 is not so much about forgiveness, although there are lots of lessons, as you see, that we're going to glean from that this morning. But Genesis 37 through 50 really is a book about how God worked through human beings to bring about the redemption of the people of Israel and ultimately our own redemption and forgiveness. As we see God preserving a family that had all types of problems. You talk about dysfunction, it was in the life of Joseph's family. Jacob and his family, his descendants, had a lot of issues. And yet I find it so encouraging this morning to think that while though many of us may have issues of our own, and many of us have things in the past that we're ashamed of, and many of us come from maybe some dysfunctional family situations, we find and can be reminded that God can nevertheless not only work through us, but ultimately bring about something awesome as he did through Jacob's family, and especially through Joseph, who then, through that lineage and the lineage of Judah, would ultimately bring about Jesus into the world. So, in Genesis 37, let's set the context for what's happening here. You'll remember in Genesis 37, verse 1, that this man Jacob lived in the land of his father, sojourning in the land of Canaan. And then he tells us about the generations of Jacob. And one of them, his sons, is Joseph, who was 17 years old, pasturing his flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. Now notice, Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Right away, we see that there is a little bit of family jealousy, a sibling rivalry. I'm sure that's never happened in your family, right? Brothers and sisters always got along. They never disagreed. Well, that's a very atypical situation if it does occur. But what we find here is what's usually typical. Siblings like to tell on one another, right? And sometimes when they tell stories or tell even maybe the truth about something that had happened, we who are the guilty party often remember that. I know that my brother and sister still harbor a little bit of resentment about me, the younger brother, because I was quick to tell mom and dad about the things that Tommy and Anita would do, that, especially Tommy, that would do that brought a little bit of, ill repute on the family. Well, in verse 3, we have another situation here of a reminder of a mistake that parents can make, and that is showing favoritism. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. I know it may be natural for us as parents to have a sense of affinity for certain personality types or other children over some others, but we really need to be careful of that. My dad and mom were especially careful about that. They wanted their children to know that we love you all the same. You know, it came to Christmas time, every one of us got 5 gifts, and now look, we bought everybody the same, we spent the same amount of money on every child. You know, they just went to great lengths. They did not want any of us to think that one was favored over the other. And yet, Tommy and Nita still are jealous of me to this day, you know? They still think that I was favored over them. But we know how that goes sometimes within family dynamics. So Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. You want to hurt your parents, then children just bicker and fuss and fight. That's what hurts mom and dad more than anything, to see your children with so much division. And I think about that a lot, by the way, for the church. We want to hurt our Heavenly Father, just bicker and fuss and fight in the church. And that often happens, and I think God weeps over that. But when I read through this, I'm reading about a family that, again, is not unlike maybe some families, maybe not unlike even your own family this morning and some of the problems. So I tell that to you not to excuse the behavior, but to remind you that, you know what, this problem of family division and the dynamics that go on is an age-old problem, okay? We're not immune to it. So in verse 5, when Joseph had a dream, he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. I mean, we could just go on, and we will. Look at this. Verse number 8, they hated him even more. Verse 11, his brothers were jealous of him because he was telling about these dreams, and it was obvious from the dream as they sort of figured it out. Wait a minute. He's talking about us bowing down before him. Who does he think he is? Joseph is a little bit puffed up. He's a little bit arrogant. So again, the dynamic of the sibling rivalry happening. And I can't help but think that maybe Joseph might have been pushing some buttons here a little bit. No younger brother ever did that, I'm sure. I know I did. And, know how to push those buttons. So maybe some of that's going on. I don't want to impugn any false or bad motives on Joseph, but what we are going to see is that the context of all this leads up to a horrific event that then brings about terrible circumstances for Joseph that is going to be then the backdrop for the struggle that he has in forgiving his brothers. I don't know if you've ever thought about that Joseph struggled with that, but I'm going to show you some things in the text here that I think really bear that out. So, you remember as the story progresses that Joseph is told by his dad to go check up on his brothers. They have gone to the plains of Dothan and there are pasturing the flocks. And they see Joseph coming from a great distance. Well, how could they not with a coat of many colors, right? They knew that was him out there. And I've been near this area, and there are wide open areas where you could easily see someone coming across the plain. If you're lodging even in the mountains or the edge of the mountains there. And so to see Joseph coming, they began, verse 18, to conspire against him. Look at this, to kill him. Now, I know my mom and dad got frustrated at times when we were chasing each other around the house. I know that Carl and I thought that we were awfully, terrible, no good for nothing parents when our children fussed and would fight. Even when we found a letter from one of our sons one day when Carla was cleaning his room, she found this letter, and it was a letter that he had given to his older brother saying, "You're not my brother anymore. I totally, disavow you of this particular moniker that you're my brother," because they'd gotten in a huge fight. And that really hurt us, to see that there was that kind of ill will between the brothers there for a while. Can you imagine being the parents of this situation where now the children have conspired to kill one of their brothers? This gets bad, really bad. And then in verse number 19, they said one to another, I'm in chapter 37 now, "Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And then as the story progresses, Reuben rescues him, and they decide, well, they'll just strip him of his clothes. So he's robbed of his dignity now. Whatever it is that he has on his own person has been taken from him, and he's thrown into a pit. Now, probably a cistern. I've been in some of those cisterns in Israel, and those ancient cisterns where they dug down into the limestone rock and lined it with plaster and then put water in there for storage. But sometimes those cisterns might be abandoned, or in a period of drought might have just a little bit of water in the bottom of it. And if the cistern plastron broke open, then there might be, mud. Things got washed down in there like animal feces and all kinds of stuff. It could have been just a real miry kind of nasty situation. Certainly to be thrown in a dark, deep cistern that was, filled with all kinds of things. I can imagine that was a frightening situation. I know that it was frightening because if you were to actually go over to chapter 42 in verse 21, where later on in the story, when Joseph puts them into prison, they don't know it's Joseph at this point, but in verse number 21, they're talking about this, and they said to one another, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother in the way in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us and we did not listen. A little more commentary, isn't it, on this situation? Sometimes we tell the story, they threw him into a pit. What brother didn't throw their little brother into a pit every once in a while? This is a much more serious situation. He's begging. The emotional, psychological harm that has happened as a result of this event has been damaging. And maybe some of you, in looking back over the past, have been in similar situations, although you weren't thrown into a literal pit, but psychologically you were thrown into a pit of despair. And you mourned. You found your soul in great distress. That's what's happened to Joseph. And if things weren't bad enough, then they get involved in human trafficking. We just read that. We read it many times. If we've grown up in the church, they sold him into this caravan of Ishmaelites going down to Egypt. Can you imagine? I mean, this is, I don't have to tell you, right? This is the day before the cell phone was invented. You can't just stop off at some 7-Eleven and maybe pick up the phone and tell mom and dad, hey, I'm okay. Or I don't even know where I am, where I'm going. It's a pretty bad situation here. Joseph is sold. And he's taken far away from his home, completely out of Canaan, across the desert of Sinai, over to a new culture, a new language that he was going to have to learn. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? But that's what happens. He's sold into slavery. Then, chapter 38, we have this story about Judah, which in many ways I think Judah becomes one of the heroes of the story later on. Chapter 39 is a little more information about Judah and the sin that he commits, but how God is going to use him ultimately to be one of the key factors in this story, who offers himself up as surety to his dad for Benjamin's life. That's in chapter 43. He pledges that he would and take the blame and bear the blame. It's sort of in many ways a foreshadowing of Christ. God working through bad situations. Even after Judah does what he does with his daughter-in-law, he doesn't know it at the time, but he thinks she's just a prostitute. I'm telling you, God works through tough situations. I saw it here in the book of Genesis. I've seen it in many of the lives Carl and I have of those with whom we've counseled over the years. You think your family situation is bad and can't be overcome, or you can't put it behind you? You need to read this story. You need to hear the story of elders and ministers and others who've worked with families and seen the grace of God and the power that's there to transform lives, to help people overcome some terrible things in their past. Well, we continue with the story. We remember that things get really bad for Joseph. He's 17 years old when he's sold into slavery. And it's not until 30 years of age that he is going to be somewhat vindicated, at least gotten out of his tough situation. He's sold to the house of Potiphar. He does a lot of good there. He's trying his best. Now, there's several times along the way that the Scripture tells us that God took care of him, that God watched over him, that God blessed Joseph. But you remember what happens next. I mean, things just keep getting bad for Joseph. This is like adding, insult to injury. So now he's falsely accused of raping Potiphar's wife. He's thrown into prison. We don't know exactly how long he was in prison, but we do know that he's there for a little while, right? Probably a couple of years or more, because that has transpired from the time that he interprets the dream of the baker and the butler, the cupbearer and the baker of Pharaoh. But as the story progresses, he begs them to remember the cupbearer that he had interpreted his dream that he was going to be released, but he forgot about him until one day the Pharaoh has the dream of the 7 fat cows that come out of the Nile and the 7 skinny cows, and they devour the fat cows but grow no fatter. Pharaoh's troubled by the dream. No one can interpret it. They don't know exactly what to do. And then what happens? The cupbearer remembers Joseph. And they go and they rescue Joseph out of prison. He is then allowed by God to interpret the dream and put into a position where he's going to rescue and save not just a nation of the Egyptians, but more importantly, ultimately a family, his family, who in a time of drought would come to buy grain at Egypt. Now you think, okay, 13 years have passed. Surely he's forgotten a lot about this. And to some degree that's true, but you have to know he remembers it, because if you turn to chapter 41, look at verse 51. Joseph has 2 children here listed, Manasseh and Ephraim. What does Manasseh mean? Look at verse 51. God has made me forget all my hardship in all my father's house. Well, I think that means, okay, psychologically he's better, but he really hasn't forgotten it, because every time he calls his son's name Manasseh, isn't he really remembering the hardship? I mean, emotionally, maybe he's in a better place. Seems like he certainly is. But you call your son, God has made me forget all my hardship. You have to think, I do remember the days of my hardship. Or the next son, Ephraim, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. This hurt Joseph deeply. And he thinks the past is behind him. But it comes back, quote, to haunt him, doesn't it? Does that ever happen to you? You moved on with your life. You thought things were okay. And suddenly, the past rears its head. We've worked with a lot of families over the years who had to deal with similar situations. A father who was abusive to their daughter who now one day shows up on their doorstep seeking restitution or needing help. Or maybe a divorced situation where now the estranged husband or wife comes back wanting something, needing something, wants to get involved in the lives of the children. I mean, we can go on and on. We know that sometimes our past doesn't always go away, does it? So as you look at this anatomy folding before us and review it, Joseph, as we're going to see in the story, who has a little trouble forgiving, we've got to know there's a lot of history involved in here. And I will say again, I'm not suggesting that Joseph's the one at sin here at all, but I'm saying that if you look at it objectively, he might have played a little bit of role in sort of continuing on the jealousy and the bitterness that existed between he and his brothers. There might have been just a little bit of something there that happened. I don't know. But a precipitating event, there was, as you begin, the years of bondage and unresolved conflict, chapters 39 through 41. And then notice this, in chapter 42, verse 7. When they finally show up, what does he do? Verse 7, Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. Isn't that what we do when it comes to our past and people that have hurt us so deeply? We treat them like strangers. We're harsh in our tone toward them. But then as you progress to the story, look at verse number 7, or verse number 9. He makes some verbal indictments. Have we ever done that when it comes to dealing with our past and people that have hurt us? Verse 9, Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them, and he said to them, "You are spies. You've come to see the nakedness of the land." Did he really believe that? I wonder. I have a hard time thinking that he really believed they were spies there. Maybe he wanted it to be true, to have some reason to accuse them. But isn't that what we do when we're hurt? We find reasons to indict people of things that may or may not be true. We don't know, but we do it anyway. I understand it, right? As we talked about this weekend, when someone harms us, what do? We are tempted to harm them back. You say something evil to me, I'm tempted to say something evil to you. We're suffering. We want to eliminate that suffering, and some of the ways we do that is to sort of lash back out. So you've got these indictments that are made here. And verse 10, they said to him, "No, my Lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies." And he said to them, "No." So now he knows that they're telling the truth. They're servants of one man, but no, you're not. You've come to spy out the nakedness of the land. So, verbal indictments are made. Then, verse 11, he denies the truth. That's not the case. I really know why you're here. So sometimes when we're hurt, we impugn motives, don't we? We deny the reality of really the present situation. And then you move down through the text and this happens next. When we're hurt, when we don't want to forgive, we tend to shut people away. So in verse 15, let's start there. By this you shall be tested. That is, we're going to put you into prison. And then in verse 16, send one of you and let him bring your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested, whether this is true or not. Okay, I'm having a hard time believing this. He certainly hasn't revealed himself and his true feelings about everything. He's made these accusations. But verse 17, he put them all together in custody for 3 days. So he imprisons them. He holds them at arm's length. And I know, again, when it comes to forgiveness, we are tempted to do that as well, isn't it? I'm not sure where you are on this. Let me sort of let you prove yourself over time. Even then, I'm going to make these accusations against you, and I'm certainly going to shut you away. Then, as you continue through the text, it's obvious that he's got some real unresolved conflict here. Look at verse 18. And on the 3rd day, Joseph said to them, do this and you will live, for I fear God. And if you're honest men, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody, right? And that's where we read that as he puts them into custody, that they start remembering, that maybe this has happened because of what we did to Joseph. So they're obviously feeling a great deal of guilt and remorse over what they have done and thinking about the past. Though, again, they don't know it's Joseph yet, but they're sort of making a connection between the consequences of their sin and their present circumstances. Now, Reuben, in verse 22, answers him, did I not tell you to not sin against the boy, but you did not listen? And so they're arguing, and they're fussing, and they're fighting about it. But look at verse 24. Joseph turns away from them and he weeps. I'm telling you, family dynamics and things of the past and relationships cause a lot of hurt and harm. And while Joseph is struggling to forgive, we need to also remember that when we commit wrong as the perpetrators, how long the hurt continues in the lives of people that we've harmed. Hurt, conflict can go unresolved for many years for people. It's hard to forgive. We remember the heart, the hurt. Well, continue on down. Verses 19 through 20, he's reluctant to trust. In verses 24 through 30, as we've just read, there's even more unresolved pain that's revealed in the text. And then, Joseph has a little bit of a vindictive spirit, and he begins to play some games. Now again, we can argue about the integrity of this. I get it. I'm not trying to in some way suggest that Joseph wasn't a good man. I'm saying that when it comes to hurt and harm, you've got to understand that as human beings, we struggle. And if we're the perpetrator, we need to understand it from their perspective, the innocent one. If we're the innocent one, we need to try to understand it from the perpetrator's perspective as best we can. I'm just saying that what we often do, even when people seek restitution, even when it's obvious that they are struggling over this, we're hesitant. We hold back. And maybe we even play a few testing games along the way. Certainly, Joseph is doing that. All right, I'll let you go, but I'm going to hold on to your brother. I'm going to wait until to see if Benjamin is truly alive, to see whether or not you've actually are telling the truth. And so they end up holding on to Simeon, and he lets the brothers go home, but the story continues, doesn't it? For a long time now. This goes on before he's ready to forgive. He ends up putting their money back in their sacks for the grain that they bought. Fills all the grain, puts their money back in the sack, and of course they are very fearful when in stopping at a place to take refuge or to rest for the night, they find the money in their sacks, and they are afraid. They go back home, and they live on the food for a while, But they leave Simeon there. I mean, think about how long this is going on now. All the repercussions of all of this because of a family that did not know, in many ways, the pure and true love of God. They're going to come to know it. But all the pain that is being caused here and all the issues and the situations and the fallout from the jealousy, from the hatred, from the favoritism, sin has a way of continuing to plague us and harm us. And so finally, when things get desperate again and they're struggling about going back, remember Jacob doesn't want to let them go back and to take Benjamin, that's for sure. But finally, Judah in chapter 43, verse 8, says, I'll be surety. I'll make a pledge. And he takes the leadership role in this situation. He steps forward and he tells his dad, we've got to do this. We've got to see the greater good of the family here in this situation. And so he takes Benjamin and the other brothers, and they go back, and Joseph sees them, or the report comes that they are coming back, and they have this feast. And he brings them in. He's so excited, of course, to see Joseph, to see Benjamin. And if you take a look at chapter 43, verse 30, when he sees Benjamin, what happens? He has to go outside and he weeps, enters into his chamber. I mean, he is hurting over all of this. He is desperately hurting. Now, in the last few moments that we have, I want us to see what Joseph does to forgive. How does he begin to forgive? The first thing he does is he lets go of his emotions. I don't know what it is about us that just wants to keep everything in. We keep a stiff upper lip. I don't want to cry because maybe that'll show my weakness or that they've hurt me or harmed me in some way. God instilled within us the ability to cry, and I believe there's a reason for that. As one writer said, those tears are like miniature messengers from God, reminding us of the catharsis that can take place when we purge our emotions and when we cry. Thankfully, Joseph teaches us that. In chapter 45, verse 1, there is finally a confession of the truth of who he is. When he reveals himself, he opens up. He makes himself vulnerable. And then in chapter 45, we read this. There are these uninhibited emotions as he cries. See if we can get the next ones to come up here. There's a breaking down of the walls. Look in verse 4. Joseph says to his brothers, come near to me. I'm not going to hold you at arm's length anymore. It's important for us to hug. It's important for us to break down those barriers. The next one. Let's go ahead. There we go. He shows a deep concern for them. And now, don't be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me. For God sent me before you to preserve life. Isn't it amazing that Joseph can take a situation that was bad, that was wrong, and see, well, okay, what ultimately can happen out of all of this? Is there something we can learn from this situation? Somewhere that we can grow? Not excusing the past, not at all saying that it was okay, that God wanted him to be sold in this way. The point is that even through those hard circumstances, if we look for them, we can realize that maybe out of this I had to learn dependency on God. That God took it and ultimately made good out of it. Not that what happened was good at all. And I think that once we begin to realize that and to see the overall providence of God and to see the bigger and the greater picture, because that's what happens here. See, he understood the larger picture, verses 6 through 8. And then there is this invitation for resolution. There's provision for restitution. Wow, this is what forgiveness does. It doesn't hold people at arm's length. It doesn't just keep them in prison. We're vulnerable. We do right. We follow the example of Jesus. And we make sacrifices. And we embrace others. We shed tears. It's a beautiful story. But then ends with a family that's reconciled. And a family who was brought to Egypt and allowed to stay now in a land where one day they would leave and inherit the promised land and ultimately bring about the Savior into the world, that we then have forgiveness today and can become a part of God's family. Isn't it fascinating to think about something that took place maybe some close to 4,000 years ago? Not quite that long, but something like that. 3,700 years ago. Events that transpired that long ago, and because of the power of forgiveness and what took place after difficult situations, that we today are beneficiaries. You never know what can happen when you decide to make things right in your family. You never know the long-term blessings that will occur for generations to follow when we walk across that aisle and we extend a heart of compassion and forgiveness to people who have hurt us, who have harmed us. It's a great story here. Wonderful story of how God helped a family in crisis. I don't care what kind of crisis you may find yourself in. By the grace of God and the power and the example found here in the life of Joseph, we can do the same. We can be like Joseph. And we can make a difference in our family now and in generations hereafter. May God help us to do that. If you want a passage that will maybe help you even in terms of thinking about marriage overall, here's a little homework assignment for you. In Matthew chapter 18, in a text and in a section about forgiveness, there is a powerful and wonderful reminder. Let's go ahead and bring all those up so everybody could see those. This clicker isn't working too good. There we go. You really find a means of a process that we can go through for families by examining that chapter and what Jesus taught about forgiveness. So take a look at that. Let's do all we can to follow the example of Christ and the example of Joseph. Now, in our worship hour, we're going to talk about true biblical love. True biblical love is what's going to help be the motivating factor for all of this. What does that look like? And how is it exemplified in the example that God gave us at Calvary? Thank you so much for your kind attention, for your willingness to be here and to study these things. Appreciate it so much.